Hello and welcome back to the beach. This is Eddy's Beach Shack and we are looking at activity-based costing here. Now to start with, we'll have a very brief look at traditional costing methods and then we'll get into activity-based costing in a lot more detail and work out exactly what's going on. So to start with, we have got traditional costing methods such as marginal and absorption costing. Very commonly used for lots and lots of manufacturing businesses around the world over the last 50 to 60 years. Traditional costing has got a huge assumption underlying it that if you were to increase or decrease the amount of production, that should now increase or decrease the amount of overhead expenditure. That's not always the case. And as the British car industry found out in the 70s, if you start to reduce production, you do not always reduce all of your overhead expenditure. So what then happened was we had to find a different way of looking at overhead expenditure and trying to understand how better to understand that and then how better to make good quality decisions around it. So what we then came up with was activity-based costing, my ABC. And what ABC does is it looks at the idea of these overheads that we have to have. So this overhead expenditure will now have to be absorbed into units of production in the same way that absorption costing would anyway. However, it's not necessarily the volume of production which creates these costs and consumes the cost, but the activities of production. So it's not the production units which actually incurs these costs, it's the activities which will incur these costs. And that is a very specific, very pedantic, a very important difference. So it's not the units that are generating costs, but the activities which generate these costs. And so what we can do with ABC is we can have a look at the idea of all of the overhead expenditure that we're going to incur, and we try to determine which activities are incurring those overhead expenditure amounts. And if we can then understand that an activity incurs a cost, hopefully we can now reduce that activity and now reduce the costs. So we can now make better quality decisions. We can now, fingers crossed, hopefully generate an additional amount of competitive advantage. And that's what we're all about, trying to find a way to generate competitive advantage. That's absolutely essential to me. And what we need to do is we need to find the activities which incur these costs. We call these activities drivers. So the thing which actually creates the cost becomes the activity, which is my driver. We're not looking at production units as a way of absorbing my fixed costs. We're looking at these activities as a way of driving these fixed costs and then find a way to absorb them afterwards. So once we've now identified that we do have activity-based costing as a way of potentially measuring our overhead expenditure, what we then need to do is we need to find what type of activity is being performed. So find out what type of activity is being performed. Once we know what activities are being performed, we can then start thinking about the costs that need to be allocated to that activity. That now gives me an activity which becomes my cost driver. It now gives me my cost pool as well. So I know exactly how much money I'm incurring by performing that activity. So I have to have the activity, which is the driver, and then the pool, which is all of the costs which come together to actually be incurred by those activities. Now, this means that, and this is where the big benefits come from. So this means that if we've got more accurate costing information, we should be able to determine exactly what type of activities incur costs. We should now be able to make a better quality decision and derive competitive advantage. The downside here is, first and foremost, generating this additional amount of information will have a cost associated with it. We need to do some sort of cost benefit analysis to make sure it's worth my while. The other issue we've got here is the management information system may not be sophisticated enough to deal with counting levels of activities, which means that you may have to set up an additional system in a parallel way to your current management information system and try and find a way to merge them. That could be a right pain in the proverbial, okay? Other issues we've got with this, overheads are either determined as being variable, which vary with production, or are going to be fixed over a specific time period. Yeah, I get that. The variable nature of these overheads will have to be determined some way, somehow. So you could do things such as quantitative analysis, including regression analysis, which is brilliant, but it's not perfect, which means that the overhead expenditure that you're trying to allocate to these drivers may be the wrong figure to start with. That could cause me some real problems. Now, there are some keen advantages to this. It's not all bad news. Some of the advantages are here. First and foremost, product costs can be more accurate, which now leads to better pricing policy decisions. Doesn't necessarily require a product, which means that any type of non-manufacturing industries can use this as well, such as accountants and auditors. Focuses management attention on the activities that incur costs. That should lead to better quality decisions. So focusing management attention on the activities should lead to better quality decisions. It allows for a better understanding of cost behavior, and that now will lead to even better decisions in addition to that. These can be really, really useful. It's not all good news though. There are some bad news issues here. It doesn't automatically change your bottom line profit, but it does allow you to have a better quality decision, which should now change your bottom line profit figure. So it does allow you to come up with a better decision. It still uses historic data and it's subjective to some extent. So we're still looking in the past and assuming that everything in the future will be the same. You still have problems with regard to cost drivers, and you may find that political power derives the cost drivers, which means that the cost driver information you have is not always going to be the best. Another interesting aspect with regard to ABC is it can now lead to activity-based budgeting. So activity-based budgeting, ABB. So activity-based budgeting is a system that records, researches and analyzing their activities that lead to costs for businesses. And then that activity-based budget will now allow me to work out the activities I can perform to incur a certain amount of costs. Now, this type of activity-based budgeting and ABC go very, very closely hand in hand. And then the next thing that falls out from this is activity-based management, which means that the managers can try to work out whether I need to be performing a certain level of activities or not. And activity-based management is all about the activity-based cost information being used in such a way that it can now generate a competitive advantage. We use detailed economic analyses of important business activities to make better quality decisions. And that's what management information is all about. And that's what good quality management is all about as well. Now, hopefully that's made sense. There's quite a lot of information in there. I do appreciate that. But it's all good fun down on the beach. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll see you all back at the shack very soon.